Hey everyone. Recently, somebody asked about how to use the data in the battery habitat key database in a predictive manner, i.e., how can you use the information that we have already gathered about tree roosts and the bats that use them in a way that can help us design our survey efforts going forward. So I'm going to show you how I go about this. So if we head over to the battery habitat key website, we are looking for the database. So I click on that tab there. You can see the most recent database is available, which is May 2024. Bear in mind, when you are doing this, you need to periodically check back on the website to make sure you're using the most up-to-date version of the database. Now, essentially what we're going to be doing is inserting a pivot table into the database. So there's two ways we can do this. We can either do this in Google Sheets, as we see it here, or we can download an Excel sheet and do it that way. So I'll show you both ways. I prefer the Excel route, so we're going to start with that. So I click on File, go to Download, and I'm after the Excel sheet. So let's have a look, open that up. Okay, so here we have the database, and it's currently saved with the view all the way over here. So what I'm going to do is just kind of scroll back up to here and get up to the top left. I've noticed if you don't do that, sometimes it confuses the kind of initial setup of the pivot table. So we're going to click on Insert and click Pivot Table. Hopefully then what we end up with is it's automatically selecting the range that we're interested in, which is essentially this whole sheet. So I can see there it says A1 to EC 8000 odd, so that's fine. I think that will be okay. And it's in a new worksheet, and I will click OK. So here we have the pivot table inserted, and now we just need to select the factors that we're interested in, the variables that we're interested in. So you can see on the right-hand side, we have all of the options, and these essentially are the columns that were running across the top of the sheet as we were previously looking at it. And I select the following in the following order, okay? So I'm kind of interested in tree species, and for obvious reasons, and it seems a really obvious place to start. So I'm going to click species. So it's listed on species on here, but that does mean tree species. And when you click these things, we need to make sure that they end up in rows. Sometimes they pop into some of these other columns. If they do, you can just click and drag them across, but it's ended up where we wanted to, so that's grand. After that, I'm going to select phase 1 habitat type. I'm then going to select PRF type. So scroll back up. Where are we? No, scroll down, in fact. PRF type. I then will select bat species, so back at the top, and then finally season. Okay, so that's got everything I want. I've noticed is actually put it in a slightly different order to the way I want it. So I wanted them in the order I selected them, but it's put them in reverse order now. So I'm just going to reorganize these. So species at the top, if it will let me move it. Maybe I'll move season down. Is that a better way of doing it? Okay, so essentially I want species, phase 1 habitat type, PRF. Oh, why is this being a pain? There. No. Come on, Excel, work with me. Why is this not working? Right. Okay, I think that's it. Got them in the order I want. So tree species, phase 1 habitat type, the type of PRF, bat species, and season. Now you can select as many or as few as these as you want. I kind of think these are a reasonable place to start, but if you wanted to add some in or take them away, it's kind of entirely your prerogative. So people in the past have told me about how they've used height is quite a useful factor, especially when you're thinking about maternity roosts. You can also think about maybe stem and limbs. So there was an example of a trainee of mine incorporating that into a decision about desiccation fissures. And whilst there were records of desiccation fissures holding bats in the stem for the tree species he was looking at, actually when he looked at branches, which was the feature he had on his tree, it didn't have any records. So kind of you can play around with these things, but as I say, we're going to start with this to begin with. So you now see this is kind of set up on the right hand side. Annoyingly, it sets it up and it's fully expanded. So typically what I do is I collapse the entire field, and then you can see we've just got tree species there. You can save the sheet at this point, and just so you've got a record of it basically. And so you can, if you ever want to go back, you've got the pivot table already set up for you, so you don't have to faff around with it. So I've just saved that there. So now the way you can use this is you can go out and you can do your surveys and say, okay, well, I know the species, I know the habitat is in, I know the type of PRF. Let's use that information to work out, first of all, whether bats have been recorded in a similar type of feature, and if so, which species and when. And then you can use that information to target your surveys at the appropriate time of year. So I'm going to show maybe a couple of different examples of how this works. I'm going to start off with oak and in like a broadleaf semi-natural woodland, just because it will return loads of records. And then I'm going to pick something slightly more obscure and see how few, how many or few records it produces by comparison. So just a word of warning on oak, we have English oak, we have sessile oak and peduncular oak there. It also has a Quercus spur. So if you know your tree species, if you know it's Quercus robur, you probably want to go through the process for that. But you may also want to then check into Quercus spur as well, just in case the person making a record didn't know precisely which species it was. So first of all, I'm going to open up Quercus spur. Again, you can see we have an expanded list. So if I right click here, I can collapse the entire field to that point, just to make life a bit easier. I've opened the wrong one. I'm going to open Quercus robur, that's better. And so now, as I say, I'm aiming to produce an example here with lots and lots of records. So I'm going to pick the top one, the semi-natural woodland. And the reason because there's a lot of record is because typically that's where us bat folk go out and survey. And then I'm going to collapse this entire field again just to make it easier to look at. And I'm going to pick one of these. And I know woodpecker holes will be well recorded. So let's open up woodpecker hole. Great. So now what I can do is I've realized I've actually got the season of the bat species around the wrong way. But don't worry, we can change that. We can just lift this one up over here. If it will work, come on, there we go. So now if I collapse this down, you'll see that I know that for woodpecker holes on an oak tree in semi-natural woodland, actually we've had bats, a lot of bats recorded at different times of year. In fact, there's records there for all 6 phases of the year. So I can open these up. I can say, okay, well, autumn flux, actually that's an NA, so that's not a positive record. However, for mating, we've got Bechstein's noctule, brown long-eared. For nursery, we've got Bechstein's natura's noctule and brown long-eared. For pregnancy, we've got Bechstein's natura's noctule and Myotispur. Spring flux, Bechstein's, and winter not applicable. So no records from there. So out of the 6 phases of the year then, we have records of bats using this type of feature in an oak tree, in this type of habitat, for 4 out of the 6 phases. So therefore, if bats have previously been recorded in those types of trees, in that habitat and that feature, then it would make sense that we should also be surveying at that time of year because there's evidence that bats have been present at that time of year before. So we can use this to say, okay, well, we're not going to worry about autumn flux and winter for this particular tree, but we're going to focus our efforts on spring flux, the pregnancy, the nursery, and the mating periods. And if you refer to the Battery Habitat Key book, that tells you how many visits we need to make in each of those phases to give us a more likely than not outcome of finding bats. And it's slightly complicated. It will vary by species, and they do this essentially because there's more justification for having a higher survey effort when we have particularly rare species compared to those who are more common. Cool. So I hope that helps. The main thing really is to play around with it and see what results you get. And this example I've given you, you can see there's lots of records there, and that might strike people as a bit daunting and think, well, if I just follow the Bat Conservation Trust guidance, I only need to pick 3 dates and I can do those randomly at any time of year. Whereas this actually is saying, well, there's a minimum of 4 periods we need to survey. So that might not work particularly well for my project, the timescales of the project I'm working on, and it's likely to increase the survey effort and therefore the cost. And this is the major hurdle that people seem to be struggling with. But to my mind is that if we have records of bats using these types of features at these times of year, then we should be surveying at this time of year, because if we're not, how can we be confident in a negative result? So it might seem a bit daunting for an oak tree, but let's go and pick something slightly more obscure, shall we? So let's do ash. So still quite a common tree species, but I would imagine we have fewer records than oak, and we will pick a habitat where they're kind of less frequently recorded. So first of all, if you're recording an ash tree in a habitat that's not listed here, then that suggests there's no record, and the justification could be made for not doing any further surveys. In this case, let's have a look at hedgerow. Say we had a hedgerow tree. Let's open that up, and we can see we have a small number of features there. And if I'm then saying, okay, well, I think I've got a hazard beam on it, there you go. So whilst someone has submitted a record, there's never been a bat found in a hazard beam on an ash in a hedgerow that has been submitted to the battery habitat key. So you could use the lack of records, to justify essentially there's no point doing further surveys on that particular tree. And equally, if your potential roost feature is not listed here, so let's say it was a subsidence crack or transverse snap, and you get to this far and they're not listed, then again, you can infer from that there's no record submitted to date, so there's no justification to carry on surveying. Right, so that was the process with an Excel sheet. I'll just show you quickly how you can do the same thing if you don't own Excel, if you want to do it on Google Sheets instead. Essentially what you need to do is save it as a Google Sheet. The one on the website essentially is a read-only, so you can't edit that one. We'll give it a second to catch up, and then we do the same thing basically. So we go to Insert, and we want to do Pivot Table. It's got the full range there, which is good. We want a new sheet as well, and we've got the same thing basically. So we want to start off with, if you remember, we started with species, so we can take that to, was it rows? I think that's right. Let me just double check. It was rows, yes. And then what did we have after that? Phase 1 habitat type. And then we had PRF type, I believe. And then season. And finally, bat species, which is at the top. Cool. Have I done that correctly? Where's season gone? Cool. I think I may have inadvertently added two things together there. Season and bat species. Cool, there we go. So we've ended up with the same thing happening here. Phase 1 habitat type, do I not have that? Let's add that in. Cool. Lovely. So we have the same result, but on a Google Sheet. And as I mentioned, you can play around with this. You can add or take away any of these factors. But yeah, have a go at it. Play around with it and see what you think. If you have any more questions, feel free to give me a shout. I think it's a really good tool to actually help us take a step forward from just picking random dates to do surveys to actually targeting when we should be undertaking surveys, but also give us a justification for why we don't think additional surveys are necessary in certain circumstances, i.e. where we haven't had previous records. Cheers.